I wasn't planning on staying in the cabin. Not really. But life had a way of pushing me into places I never intended to be, and that's how I ended up at the edge of an ancient forest, in a decrepit old cabin I inherited from my grandfather, nestled deep in the Adirondack Mountains. The place was barely more than a wooden box with a roof, perched precariously on the edge of a lake that shimmered darkly even in daylight. It was the sort of place that had been forgotten by time. No cell reception, no nearby towns, just endless trees and the occasional deer that would appear out of nowhere and vanish just as quickly. Grandpa had always been a bit of a recluse. I barely knew him. He'd moved out here after Grandma died, and though my dad used to visit him as a kid, the visits became less frequent as he grew older. When Grandpa passed away last year, the cabin was left to me, his only grandchild. I had no intention of ever living here, but after losing my job and my apartment in the same month, the cabin seemed like the only option. I'd been there for only a few days when I first noticed the footprints. I was sitting on the rickety porch one evening, the air thick with the smell of pine and earth, when I noticed something out of the corner of my eye, just at the edge of the woods. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but when I stood up and walked closer, I saw them. Deep, heavy prints in the damp soil, leading from the forest straight toward the cabin. They were odd, though. Larger than any human's, but shaped almost like a man's. The steps were uneven, as if whoever or whatever made them had been dragging one foot. Limping, a chill ran down my spine. I followed the trail with my eyes, expecting to see them lead away into the distance, but they stopped abruptly, right at the edge of the porch steps, as if whoever had made them had simply vanished. And I shook my head, trying to brush it off. I was tired, stressed, and probably imagining things. Maybe it was a bear, or a particularly large deer. But even as I tried to convince myself, a small voice at the back of my mind whispered something else, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. Something's watching you. That night, I locked the door. A door that had never needed locking, according to my grandfather's notes, and went to bed early, trying to ignore the creeping sense of unease. But sleep didn't come easily. The cabin was old, and every creak and groan of the wooden beams felt amplified in the silence of the night. My mind kept drifting back to those footprints, to the way they had stopped just short of the porch. At some point, I must have drifted off because I was startled awake by a noise, a sharp, rhythmic thudding like someone knocking on the walls outside. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. The noise came again, this time louder. It sounded like it was coming from the back of the cabin, near the small, dirt-packed cellar where Grandpa used to store firewood. I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and tiptoed to the window, my breath catching in my throat. The moon was bright, casting long shadows across the yard, but I couldn't see anything out of the ordinary. Still, the knocking persisted, louder and more insistent. It took me a few moments to muster the courage to go outside. I cursed under my breath, knowing that I had to check it out, if only to prove to myself that there was nothing there. The cold night air bit at my skin as I stepped outside, the flashlight beam bobbing unsteadily as I crept around the side of the cabin toward the cellar. The knocking had stopped, replaced by an eerie, suffocating silence that pressed in on me from all sides. I reached the cellar door and hesitated. It was slightly ajar, just enough for a sliver of darkness to escape into the night. I knew I hadn't opened it. Grandpa always kept it locked to keep out the wildlife, and I had done the same since I arrived. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling despite myself. No answer. I pushed the door open the rest of the way and shone the flashlight inside. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing a set of wooden stairs leading down into a small, dirt-floored space. The cellar was empty, as I expected, except for a few old tools and piles of rotting firewood. But as I stepped inside, something caught my eye, a faint glimmer on the dirt floor just to the right of the stairs. I bent down, and my stomach churned as I realized what it was. A shard of broken glass, its edges smeared with something dark and sticky. Blood. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Had someone been hurt here? But who? I was the only one for miles, as far as I knew. Then I noticed something else. A faint set of footprints, leading away from the cellar and back toward the forest. But these were different from the ones I'd seen earlier. Smaller. Human. I slammed the cellar door shut and ran back into the cabin, bolting the door behind me. My heart was racing, every nerve in my body on edge. I didn't sleep at all that night, just sat there in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the forest outside, jumping at every rustle of leaves, every distant howl of an animal. The next morning, I found myself staring at the forest with a mixture of dread and curiosity. I couldn't stay here, not with whatever was out there. But where would I go? I had no money, no job, and nowhere else to turn. The cabin was all I had left. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching me, waiting. Over the next few days, I tried to put the incident out of my mind. I spent my time cleaning up the cabin, repairing the sagging roof, and chopping wood for the coming winter. But every time I stepped outside, I felt that same unnerving sensation, the feeling of being watched, and every night, just as I was starting to drift off to sleep, I'd hear it. That same rhythmic knocking, coming from the woods. It wasn't until a week later that I finally saw him. It was late afternoon, the sun already sinking behind the trees, casting long shadows across the yard. I was out by the lake, collecting firewood, when I noticed something moving at the edge of the forest. At first, I thought it was another deer, but as I squinted into the gloom, I realized it was something else. Something taller, more angular. A man. He was standing just inside the tree line, barely visible in the fading light. I could make out his silhouette, tall and gaunt, his limbs unnaturally long and thin. He was dressed in tattered clothes that hung off his frame like old rags, and his head was tilted to one side, as if he were watching me with intense curiosity. For a moment, we just stood there, staring at each other across the yard. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead, and my heart pounded so loudly in my chest I was sure he could hear it. I wanted to call out to him, to ask who he was and what he was doing here, but the words caught in my throat. Something about him felt wrong, unsettling. Then, as suddenly as he had appeared, he turned and slipped back into the trees, disappearing into the shadows without a sound. And I stood there, frozen in place, long after he had gone. My mind was reeling, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. But no matter how I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something deeply unnatural about the man. Something that didn't belong in this world. That I went back inside and locked the door, my hands trembling as I turned the key. I didn't sleep at all that night, just sat by the window, staring out into the darkness, waiting for him to return. But he didn't, not that night at least. The next morning, I found something else outside the cabin, something that made my blood run cold. A set of footprints, leading from the edge of the forest to the front door, and then back again. But these weren't the same heavy, dragging prints I had seen before. These were smaller, lighter, human, and they were fresh. I spent the rest of the day inside, pacing the floor, trying to figure out what to do. I couldn't stay here, not with him out there, but I had no idea where to go or how to get there. The nearest town was miles away, and I had no car, no phone, nothing. But staying here wasn't an option either. As the sun began to set, I finally made up my mind. I would pack a bag and leave at first light, head into the woods and try to find the nearest road. Maybe I could hitch a ride to town, find someone who could help me. But as I started to pack my things, I heard it again. That same rhythmic knocking, this time louder, more insistent. It was coming from the front door. That I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. The knocking continued, each thud reverberating through the cabin like a drumbeat. I crept toward the door, my breath catching in my throat. I could see a shadow through the frosted glass. A tall, thin figure, standing just outside. That I reached for the doorknob, my hand trembling uncontrollably. Every instinct told me to run, to hide, but I couldn't. I had to know who or what was out there. That I took a deep breath and yanked the door open, the cold night air rushing in like a wave. There was no one there. The yard was empty, the trees silent and still. But as I stepped outside, something caught my eye. A small object lying on the porch, just in front of the door. That it was a photograph, old and faded, the edges curled and yellowed with age. I picked it up, my hands shaking, and turned it over. The photo was of a family, 2 adults and a child, standing in front of the very same cabin, decades ago by the look of their clothes. The man was tall and thin, with a stern expression, his eyes dark and hollow. The woman stood beside him, her face obscured by shadows. And the child, a young boy, maybe 8 or 9, stood in front of them, his face pale and drawn, his eyes wide with fear. That I flipped the photo over and saw a date scrawled on the back. November 12th, 1924. My blood ran cold. That was nearly 100 years ago. That I dropped the photo and stumbled back into the cabin, slamming the door behind me. My mind was racing, trying to piece together what was happening, but nothing made sense. Who were these people? And why had someone left this photo on my porch? I didn't sleep at all that night, just sat in the dark, clutching the flashlight, my eyes glued to the window, waiting for the knocking to start again. But it never did. When morning finally came, I was exhausted, my nerves frayed to the breaking point. I had to leave. I couldn't stay here another night. I packed my bag quickly, grabbing only the essentials, and headed for the door. But as I reached for the doorknob, I hesitated. Something was nagging at the back of my mind, something I couldn't quite place. I turned and looked around the cabin, my eyes scanning the room. Everything was just as I had left it, except for one thing. The photograph was gone. I searched the entire cabin, top to bottom, but it was nowhere to be found. It was as if it had simply vanished. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to make sense of what was happening. Was I losing my mind? Had I imagined the whole thing? But I knew I hadn't. The footprints, the knocking, the man in the woods, they were all real. I couldn't explain them, but I knew they were real. That I didn't waste any more time. I grabbed my bag and left the cabin, heading into the woods with only a vague sense of direction. The trees loomed overhead, their branches casting long, skeletal shadows across the forest floor as I walked. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the man from the woods was somewhere behind me, just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. That I quickened my pace, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The forest was dense, the undergrowth thick and tangled, but I pushed through, desperate to put as much distance between myself and the cabin as possible. But no matter how far I walked, the feeling of being watched never left me. It clung to me like a shadow, growing stronger with each passing minute. And then, just as the sun began to set, I saw it. A light in the distance, flickering through the trees. My heart leaped with hope. It had to be a house or a road or something. Anything that could lead me back to civilization. That I broke into a run, my legs burning with exhaustion, but I didn't care. I had to reach that light. But as I got closer, I realized something was wrong. The light wasn't coming from a house or a road. It was coming from a fire, a small, crackling campfire, surrounded by a circle of stones, and standing beside it was the man from the woods. He was just as I had seen him before, tall, thin, with long, gangly limbs and tattered clothes. But now, in the flickering light of the fire, I could see his face more clearly. That it was pale and gaunt. His skin stretched tight over his skull, his eyes sunken and hollow. His mouth was twisted into a grimace, as if he were in constant pain. He stared at me with those empty eyes, and for a moment, I was paralyzed with fear. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't even breathe. Then he smiled, a slow, sickly smile that sent a wave of nausea through me. "Come closer," he said, his voice a raspy whisper. That I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. "Stay away from me," I shouted, my voice trembling. But he didn't move. He just stood there, watching me with that same twisted smile. "You can't leave," he said. "Not now, not ever." I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my ears, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't know where I was going, didn't care. I just had to get away from him, had to get as far away as possible. But no matter how far I ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was right behind me, that he was watching me, waiting for the moment when I would finally collapse from exhaustion. The forest closed in around me, the trees pressing closer and closer, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The ground beneath my feet was uneven, the roots and rocks threatening to trip me with every step. That I stumbled, nearly falling. But I caught myself and kept running, my legs burning with the effort. The light from the fire had long since disappeared, leaving me in near total darkness, the only sound the ragged gasps of my own breath. And then, just as I thought I couldn't run any farther, I burst out of the trees and into a small clearing. That I stopped, panting, my heart hammering in my chest. The clearing was empty, save for a single solitary object standing in the center. That it was a gravestone, weathered and worn, the inscription barely visible in the dim light. I stumbled closer, my legs shaking, and squinted at the words etched into the stone. But as I read the name, my blood ran cold. That it was my name. The date of death was today. That I stumbled back, my mind reeling, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. But there was no explanation, no rationalization that could make sense of this. Then I heard it, the soft, raspy whisper right behind me. "You can't leave," the man said, his voice a low, menacing hiss. "Not now, not ever." I spun around, but there was no one there. The clearing was empty, the trees silent and still. But I knew he was there, watching me, waiting. And in that moment, I realized the truth I had been trying to deny since I first arrived at the cabin. That I was never going to leave this place. This was where I would die, and he was going to make sure of it. My story doesn't end here, though. The days blur together, time loses meaning, and the boundary between reality and nightmare vanishes. Every time I think I've escaped the man, the woods pull me back to that gravestone, back to where my name is carved into the stone. Each time, it's as if the forest itself is playing with me, mocking my attempts to flee. Sometimes, I see him in the distance, just standing there, half hidden among the trees. His eyes burn into me, a reminder that no matter how far I run, he's never far behind. The worst are the nights. When darkness falls, the knocking starts again, no longer just on the walls, but on the windows, the door, even inside the cabin itself. The sound burrows into my skull, driving me closer to the brink of madness with each passing hour. And when I can't take it anymore, when I'm on the verge of breaking, he comes to the cabin, knocking on the door, whispering in that raspy voice, "You can't leave." But this time, I'm not going to run. I can't keep running, I'm going to face him. And whatever happens, I'll find out what he is, what he wants. Maybe then, I'll find a way out of this nightmare. Or maybe, like he says, I'll never leave. But if I'm going down, I'm not going down alone.